Hi everyone, Dave here from StudyLark. This video is about the SAT writing and language section, specifically the topic of verb form. Whenever you see a question on the SAT that gives you a whole bunch of options for a different underlined verb, like this one, includes and include and including, etc., then you need to check for the proper verb form. And what that means is check for the proper verb tense and also the proper verb agreement. So what do we mean by agreement? This means that the verb has to match the person and the number of the subject. On the SAT, you really only have to pay attention to the number. So that means you have to ensure that plural subjects get plural verbs and singular subjects get singular verbs. So that sounds pretty easy, right? Well, the test writers have a whole bunch of tricks to make this task more difficult. The main trick is to put the subject and the verb far apart from each other in the sentence and to stick a whole bunch of distracting nouns, especially ones that have different number, in between. So that's to make you try to misidentify what the subject is and get the question wrong. So let's take a look at one of these. So here's a sentence that is wrong. Pollution from cars in cities where people have long commutes worsen on hot days. The verb in this sentence, can you see what it is? It's going to be worsen. And what's the subject for that verb? Well, there's a lot of nouns floating around, but the actual subject is this singular noun, pollution. And if you put that subject immediately next to the verb, it becomes pretty easy to see that they don't match. Would you say that pollution worsen? That sounds pretty wrong. So the correct verb, of course, is to say that pollution worsens. So once you found the subject, that little trick that I just did of putting that subject right next to the verb is actually really useful because you're depending on your ear to tell you whether the subject and the verb match. Basically, this is a lot better than trying to use grammar or use a question about, hey, is this a singular verb or a plural verb? And that's because a lot of times singular verbs like this one actually end in S, and that kind of drives people crazy. They get confused and they think that S means that it's a plural verb. So instead of thinking about all that grammar, just instead say, okay, here's a subject, here's the verb. Would I say pollution worsens, or is it better to say pollution worsen? And in that case, your ear will tell you that it's better to say worsens. So picking the right verb once you've found the subject is actually the easy part. I think the hard part is finding the subject in the first place. So the test writers have all sorts of, they'll insert all sorts of misleading words in an effort to sidetrack you, but your secret weapon is this, and that is to cross out any prepositional phrases or other things such as parenthetical comments or extra clauses or unnecessary phrases, because none of them can contain the subject. Especially prepositional phrases, pay very close attention to these because there's this ironclad, unbreakable grammar law that says nothing inside a prepositional phrase can ever be the subject of the sentence. So if you're looking for the subject, get those things out of there. So in our example before, how do we know that the subject was pollution and not something else like cars or cities or people or commutes? Well, it's because of getting rid of prepositional phrases and other unnecessary things. So for example, this word from, that's a preposition, and so that means from cars is a prepositional phrase, and if we're looking for the subject, we can just get that thing out of there. And in is another preposition, so if we're looking for the subject, we can kill this prepositional phrase. Where people have long commutes, this is actually a big modifying phrase. It's a relative clause, so we can get rid of that. And if you're wondering whether maybe the subject is somewhere after the verb, well, it's not, because on is a preposition, and so on hot days would be a prepositional phrase. So really, there's only one noun left in the whole sentence. That's got to be the subject, and this has to be the verb. So that's how you are able to find the right subject. So that's the sort of grammatical way of finding the subject, and that is to kind of depend on your knowledge of phrases and clauses and things like that, and be able to find the prepositional phrases and cross them out. So sometimes this doesn't always work, and so there's another technique that you can try, which is like the logic method, and that is to ask yourself, what noun is actually doing this action once you've found the verb? And you just use logic and common sense, and if there's only one reasonable possibility, then that's it, you found the subject. So in this example, it doesn't really make any sense to say that the car is, so if we're talking about the verb, which is worsen, does it make any sense to say the cars are worsening? Not really. It doesn't make any sense to say that the cities are worsening or that the hot days are worsening. So just using logic, none of those can really be the subject. The one sort of drawback here is that it actually is possible to say that a commute might worsen, especially on a hot day. And so logic alone might not allow you to totally narrow it down to a single possibility. And so probably the best thing is to rely on both logic and your knowledge of grammar rules. So let's try a little drill. And this drill is to basically find and ignore prepositional phrases in the sentences below. So if you want to, you can pause the video and take a look at these and look for the prepositional phrases. And so take a moment and try to find them all. And once you're done, unpause it and we'll talk about what they are. Okay, so in the first one, the prepositional phrases would be to graduates, because to is a preposition in this case, and in is a preposition, so in all fields, and of is a preposition, so of engineering. These are all the prepositional phrases here. In number two, the first prepositional phrase is for data. For is a preposition. And to is also a preposition, so to the request, you would get rid of that. In the third example, as is a preposition, so as a goddess is a prepositional phrase. From is a preposition, so from the Vedic period. And through is a preposition, so through the modern era is a prepositional phrase. And of is a preposition. So these are things that none of those could be the subject. In number four, you have employees elements. From is a preposition, so from his own life. In his work, that's a prepositional phrase. He has incorporated representations of himself. Of is a preposition. And throughout is a preposition, throughout the series. And for is another preposition, for the most recent exhibition. So these are all prepositional phrases. You can notice that a lot of sentences have lots and lots of prepositional phrases. In number five, of is a prepositional phrase. Near is another one, near the cliffs. Above is a preposition, above a waterfall. To is a preposition, and in is a preposition. So those are all the ones that you could get rid of. And finally, as is a preposition. On is a preposition, so this whole thing is a giant prepositional phrase. And then to and of, these are both prepositions, so all of this stuff is gone. So just remember, ignoring prepositional phrases is pretty useful when you're looking for the subject. But if the question is asking you to do some other tasks, such as like make sure that modifiers are properly next to the things that they should be modifying, then you might not want to just ignore prepositional phrases, but actually pay attention to them, pay attention to their content, and make sure that they're properly placed and things like that. So the test writers have some other tricks up their sleeves as well when you're looking for the subject. Something else that can affect verb agreement is what's called a compound subject. A compound subject is composed of two or more nouns working together for a single verb. The nouns are typically joined by a conjunction or presented as a list, and a compound subject is always plural even if the nouns within it are singular. So here's an example. We have, its rising population and confined geography have impacted the city's home prices. Here the verb is has impacted. That's a verb phrase. This is like the helper verb and this is the main verb. And the two nouns associated with it are population and geography. So use the ear test again, and to make it even more clear, you could take this whole thing, population and geography, and replace it by saying the phrase, these two things. And so would you say two things has impacted? That sounds pretty weird. And it would make a lot more sense to say that these two things have impacted. That's going to use your ear to provide you the right answer. So the correct version of this sentence is, its rising population and confined geography have impacted the city's home prices. So it's like, another trick is the use of inverted word order. So this occurs when the subject appears after the verb. A sentence with inverted word order will often begin with a bunch of prepositional phrases, and if you cross them out, as we always do when we're looking for the subject, there won't be anything left in front of the verb that could act as the subject. That indicates that the subject must be after the verb. So here's an example. If we look for the prepositional phrases, around is a preposition, so around the edge. Of is a preposition, so of the bay. And here's the verb, were. There's nothing left in front of the verb that could be the subject, and so the subject has to follow the verb. In this case, the subject is cottages, and cottages is plural, so you would say cottages were. You wouldn't say something like cottages was. So this example is correct. And in the second example, there's another situation that has inverted word order, and that's when a sentence starts with there is or there are. And the reason for that is that the word there is an adverb. So it can't be the subject, and it can't be singular or plural. So to actually figure out what the verb, the right verb agreement is, you have to look after the verb to figure out what the subject is and see whether it's singular or plural. So in this case, reason, this is singular. So that's why we have is instead of are. If it were something plural, then you would say there are no reasons, something like that. Okay, so let's try another drill. And in this one, we're just trying to find subjects. So each sentence below has a verb that's marked in bold, and we're looking for the subject of the marked verb. In some cases, there could be a compound subject, so we want to make sure to find all the different parts of it. So again, if you like, you can pause the video, try some of these out, and then after you're done, unpause it, and we'll take a look at the subjects of these. Okay, so let's check out number one. Have taught. I can already see that it's plural, so there must be some kind of plural subject for this. And I can tell that the subject in this case is challenges, because everything else is prepositional phrases and things like that. So you can put this subject right next to the verb to make sure that it makes grammatical and logical sense. And it does, in fact, make sense to say the challenges have taught me blah, blah, blah. Okay, and number two, what came into the job, or who? In this case, it's Margot. She's the subject. And all this stuff in between is set off by commas. It's sort of a non-essential clause or phrase. And so we would ignore that as we're looking for the subject. Here, the verb is are. And this is an example of inverted word order because the subject is actually the word wines. So the wines are made from white grapes, and so the subject is after the verb. In question number 4, the verb is begin, and in this case we've got a compound subject, the bass and the piano. I see that they're joined by this word and, so that's how I know that it's two things. They're both singular, but when they are joined with and, they become like a group of two things. That's why we have this plural verb. These two things begin, not this one thing begins. In number 5, you can use the sort of logic method of looking. So what is it exactly that can turn the tide of the game? It's a move in which all this stuff happens. And so this is the subject, this is the verb. In number 6, what is it that will cover a surface completely? It's the hexagons, the triangles, or the squares arranged in a repeating pattern. So that again is a compound subject. Into the bucket, under the eaves, fell the rain from the summer storms. This is another example of inverted word order. What exactly fell? Well, it's the rain. And so the subject is after the verb. And number 8, the languages spoken in regions as far from each other as southern India and the western part of Europe derive from a single common ancestor. If this is the verb, then way back here, it's the subject. Languages, those are the things that derive from the single common ancestor, so that's the subject. There's actually a couple more examples here. There is one main area in the region prone to flooding. So there is, that's that example of there is, there are, and again, the subject is going to come after the verb. In this case, the area is the subject. That's why we have a singular verb. And finally, number 10, Olivia Barber, she is the one who took home the top prize. And so all this stuff in between is just there to distract you. It cannot be the subject, and the real subject is Olivia Barber. Okay, so let's talk about the second thing. We said at the beginning when we're thinking about verb form, we have to think about verb agreement, which is what we just talked about, and also verb tense. So verb tense, there are, as you probably know, lots and lots of different tenses in the English language, and there's lots of rules governing them. Luckily, you don't need to spend a lot of time memorizing all those different categories and detailed rules. Questions about verb tense on the SAT are mostly about looking at the context of the passage and picking a verb tense that makes logical sense with the flow of ideas within the story. So, with that said, there's actually a couple of rules that you probably do need to know. You should know when to use present perfect versus simple past, and you should probably know when the past perfect tense is appropriate. So a perfect tense is one that uses have or has or had as the helper or auxiliary verb before the main verb. And present perfect uses have or has, and past perfect uses had. There are several situations in which present perfect is most commonly used, but the most important rule here is that present perfect makes sense when you're talking about an unspecified time in the past, but the simple past should be used when the time is specified. So here we have some examples. With this unspecified, like we don't know when they picked the winner, or they have opened the doors, but they don't say exactly when, and she has received an honorary doctorate. So we know she received it, but this sentence doesn't tell us when. So for all these, we're using the present perfect. It has a helper verb of have or has received. On the other hand, these simple past examples, because they actually have the time that's specified, like yesterday or 5 p.m. or at the commencement, which tells us like a particular point in time, that's why instead of saying has chosen, we just go for chose. Or that's why instead of saying they have opened it, it's just plain old opened. Or instead of saying has received, it's just plain simple past received. The past perfect tense, which uses the auxiliary verb had, is appropriate when you're talking about two different times in the past. The past perfect indicates which of these two times it occurred in the more distant past, while the simple past indicates the more recent past. So in these examples, we have sort of two different times in the past. So there's the using of the bread that happened in the past, and then there's buying, and this is like the more distant past, and so that's why this is had bought. It has that helper verb had. And then this is sort of simple past. In a way, it's kind of like if you can imagine a timeline. This is the present. This is the past. And then even more distant in the past is the past perfect. So this is like the had, done something. And then in this example, walking into the room, that's in the past. And before walking into the room was the being rearranged. So had been rearranged, especially this had, that indicates that the rearranging happened before the walking into the room. So for the most part, even though we talked about these two rules about when to use present perfect and when to use past perfect, most of the time getting a verb tense question right is more about looking at the nearby verbs and just thinking about the story in the passage. You have to reason your way to the right answer based on contextual clues. And remember, the choice that you pick doesn't necessarily have to use exactly the same tense as every verb around it. It's perfectly normal for a story to use a variety of tenses in adjacent sentences or even in the same sentence. And so finding the right answer is more about the logic of the situation and not so much about just blindly matching up tenses. So take a look at a drill here. So this is about using context to figure out the right verb tense. And so it's really about reading the story and then deciding which of the different options, there's going to be 4 different options, which of these makes sense to sort of fit the flow of the story. So again, take a look at these and try them out, and then we'll pause the video, and then afterwards we'll take a look. Okay, so in the first one, in 2016, an earthquake opened one of the volcano's long blocked magma tubes. The chamber filled with molten rock, some of which seeped through an opening to the surface. And in this case, the right answer should be began to flow down the side of the mountain, because one of the things that I would notice is seeped is in the past tense, and beginning to flow down the side of the mountain kind of occurs at the same time as when it seeped through the opening. Okay, a new study followed 8,375 people over the course of 5 years, tracking cardiovascular health and overall mortality rate. They found no benefit to using a standing desk, which came as a surprise to researchers since previous studies. And then in this case, had shown makes the most sense. The studies had shown that prolonged periods of sitting were associated with negative health outcomes. This is the past perfect, and this is a great example of sort of two events in the past occurring at different times. So found is in the past tense, and then even before finding and coming as a surprise is what the previous studies had shown. So they occurred in the more distant past, so that's why this is an appropriate choice here. Okay, the course taught us some of the science behind baking. A longer mixing time builds a stronger network of gluten in the dough. Leavening agents do something that make the dough rise, and sugars are responsible for browning and many other flavors besides simple sweetness. So in this case, these last three sentences are all in the present tense. The mixing time builds, that's in the present tense. Sugars are responsible, so that's in the present tense. And these are talking about things that are just kind of generally true, and this middle sentence should fit that same pattern. So the leavening agents release the gases that make the dough rise, so the right answer here should be release. And finally, there are many sources of information about great authors, but typically historians, what do they do? How do they rely or have relied or etc.? Primarily on the text of the author's own papers. Well, relying by itself can't be a verb without a helper verb. And will rely doesn't make sense because that's the future. And this is talk about what they typically do. So have relied is going to be the best choice. Especially because the new techniques, sorry, I should have read the whole thing. The new techniques are talking about what's happening now, and then relying primarily on the text of the author's own papers. That's what happened kind of in the past. So that's a little bit better. So as we've seen, you have a different job to do depending on whether this verb-related question is testing agreement or tense. If it's verb agreement, then your job is to find the subject before you can answer. But if it's verb tense, you don't really care about the subject. Instead, you're looking for the surrounding contextual clues to help learn how this story is being presented. So figuring out the question task is actually a really important first step. Luckily, the test writers often make it pretty easy to determine the question type just based on some patterns that show up in the answer choices. If a question is testing subject-verb agreement, you're almost always going to see two choices that have this pattern here. It's going to be the same verb, it's going to be the same tense, and it's going to be different number. That means one is singular and the other is plural. If you see that pattern in the answer choices, you should really think subject-verb agreement. On the other hand, if all the choices are using different tenses, then it's probably going to be testing verb tense. So here's an example of this. I notice in this question on the left that if you look at B and C, it's the same verb, it's the same tense. This is present tense, and this is also present tense. But this one is plural. These things follow, and this one is singular. This one thing follows. And so they have exactly that pattern. Same verb, same tense. One is singular, one is plural. That's how I would know this is probably testing verb agreement. And as soon as I saw that pattern, the first thing I would do would be to go look for the subject of the sentence. Over here, this is probably testing verb tense because all of the choices are different verb tenses. So has included is the present perfect, included is the simple past, had included is the past perfect, and will include is the future. So they're all different tenses. So I'll probably be looking for the contextual clues around it to sort of figure out what's going on. So there's also another clue to look for if it's testing verb agreement, and that is that you can sort of look for this kind of odd one out. So what I notice here is that are following, that's plural, follow, that's plural, follows is singular, and have followed is plural. probably the right answer is going to be the odd one out. So without even knowing what the question is, most of the time you can say that it's going to be the one that doesn't match. So the thing about this is you should really not rely on this trick. It should more be actually go find the real subject and make sure that you're choosing a choice that has proper verb agreement. But it can also be kind of a little way to double check to make sure that you're on the right track and that you're choosing the right one. So here's a little drill where we can check out some different possible question tasks. So let's just do these together. So take a look at the first one. We have changes, has changed, change, changes with an apostrophe here. Do you think this is more likely to be testing verb agreement or verb tense? Well, I see this pattern here where choices A and C are both in the present tense. This one is singular, this one is plural. So I would say this is probably testing verb agreement. If we take a look at number 2, lose, lost, will lose, and are losing. These are all different tenses. This is present tense, this is past tense, future, and this is present progressive. So I would say that this one is testing verb tense, most likely. So I would go look for the contextual clues. For number 3, has stood, have been standing, are standing, have stood. Here, choices A and D are both in the present perfect, has and have. This one is singular, this one is plural. So I would say that this one is probably testing verb agreement. And finally, number 4, draws, drew, will draw, and has drawn. These are all different verb tenses. So I would say that this is probably testing verb tense. Okay, the last thing that we can do here is to go through just some examples and work on them together. So I'll basically talk you through these. Within the Study Lark book, this is just the first part of a much larger drill of questions. And if you want to take a look at the longer drill, then just pick up a copy of the book and you can get lots and lots of practice with these verb form questions. So if we take a look at this first one, it says, some of the first acts of Congress, including one that regulates the manner of administering an oath of office, remains in effect today. So I do see that pattern where remains and remain are both in the present tense, but they have opposite. One is singular and one is plural. So I'm thinking this is probably verb agreement. And so I say, okay, well, what's the subject? What remains in effect today? And it's some of the acts. Some of these acts, that is talking about a plural thing. So I should look for a plural verb. And you can even say, do that little trick where you say, replace that phrase with these things. So if you do that, would you say these things remains, or would you say these things remain? Hopefully your ear will tell you that remain makes a lot more sense. So the right answer here is choice C. Okay, number 2, a genetic analysis by a team of molecular anthropologists led by this person provide the best look yet at the herder's genetic history. So what do I see here? I see provide and provides. These are, again, both in the present tense. And one of them is singular and one of them is plural. So again, I'm looking for singular, plural, in other words, subject-verb agreement. And in this case, what is providing the best look yet? Well, it's not this person, it's actually the genetic analysis. So if I had to pick a single word to be the subject, it would be analysis. Part of the reason I know that it's analysis and not anything else, well, for one, by is a preposition, so by a team, that's a prepositional phrase, I can get rid of that. Of is a preposition, so of molecular anthropologists, that's something I can also get rid of, that can't be the subject. And then all of this, you notice a comma here and a comma here. This is some kind of like non-essential phrase telling us more about the team, but this is not something that's going to be the subject of the sentence. And so the only noun that's left is analysis. So analysis is singular, and so again, I'll put the subject right next to the verb. Would you say an analysis provide or an analysis provides? Hopefully, again, your ear will tell you that provides is the right answer. It's going to be choice B. Okay, number 3, data from the investigation helped Parrish convince the city council members that they could reduce expenditures from the Public Works Department if recycling rules were modernized. Encouraged by these possible savings, officials implemented a new single-stream recycling program. So unlike the last two, I don't see this pattern of two different verbs in the same tense. So this is past tense, this is past progressive, this is past perfect, and would be implementing, that's something else that has like a modal verb attached to it. So they're different. So here, it looks like the story is being told in the past tense. So the data from the investigation helped, that's in the past tense. And they were encouraged, so I would say that implemented makes the most sense. They weren't, yeah, it's going to be the past tense. So in this case, no change. All right, let's do 3 more. Most of the original homemade circuit boards no longer function, as replacement parts have become impossible to find, but others had worked perfectly well. So the most effective thing to do here is get rid of this stuff because that's there to distract you. And again, I think they're testing verb tense in this case because I don't have that pattern of singular plural verbs. And what I notice is no longer function. Function is in the present tense. And so I would look for another verb that's also in the present tense, and that's going to be choice B, work. And so some of them, if you wanted to kind of distill the sentence into the bare bones to make it a little bit easier to see what's going on, some don't function, but others work perfectly well. That's kind of the essential ingredients of the sentence. Number 5, advocates of vitamin D would add that besides bone strength, there are several additional health benefits conferred by this compound. So for one thing, this is the wrong there, so we can get rid of choice A and choice D for that reason. And then if we remember, usually if you have there is or there are, the subject is going to come after the verb. And so in this case, we're going to look here and see that benefits is the subject. And that's plural, so we're going to go for there are instead of there is. This is singular. So this is choice B is the right answer. And finally, number 6, people who learn to speak a new language gain new perspectives, improve confidence, better decision-making skills, and deeper connections to other cultures. So we're now back to that pattern that we saw before, where I have gain and gains. These are both in the present tense, but one is singular and one is plural. So I'm going to look for the subject. In this case, the subject is people who learn to speak a new language. That's there to distract you. Language is singular, but who learn to speak a new language, that's going to be this it's a relative clause. It's not part of the subject. And so because this is plural, we don't want to say people gains. It would make more sense to say people gain. So that's where we're going to go for. No change here. Thanks for watching. I hope you found this useful. All this and much more can be found in the Study Lark Guide to SAT Writing and Language. Remember to like and to subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thanks.